Maya Lin swore softly under her breath, hitting the rewind function on the terminal for the third time. It couldn't be real. It just couldn't. Then again, if this was a hegemony trick, it was the most elaborate bit of trolling the galaxy had ever seen. Standard galactic chatter buzzed all around her. Trade updates, diplomatic squabbles over mineral rights on some desolate asteroid, the occasional bit of celebrity gossip from one of the more flamboyant star systems. Her shift at the Interspecies Communications Hub was as stimulating as watching ancient Earth-era paint dry. The signal had sliced through all that, garbled, layered over itself with a dozen alien encryption protocols, yet beneath it all pulsed the desperate thrum of carrier waves pushed past their limit. Most importantly, it bore the unmistakable fingerprint of hegemony tech. Hegemony signals were, as a rule, boring. Orders, supply requests, smugly detailing the swift assimilation of some hapless new world. Threats, but rarely ones they needed to broadcast. This was fear bleeding through the layers of code. "Hey, Lin, daydreaming about being literally anywhere else?" Her supervisor, Karn, ambled over, oversized mug of some pungent Vraxian tea in hand. He was a decent sort, as far as mid-level bureaucrats went, just utterly resigned to Earth's backwater status quo. Maya's usual response, some half-hearted joke about the allure of paperwork, stuck in her throat. Karn, I think you need to hear this." His antennae twitched, whether in interest or mild irritation, it was hard to tell. "Better be juicy. The higher-ups have been a nightmare today. Some trade talks went belly up." She played back the signal, cutting it off the moment the scrambled mess started to resolve into actual language. "That's hegemony, right? Something's wrong, majorly wrong, but I can't." Karn's mug dropped. It didn't shatter. His species was thankfully resilient, but the brown sludge splashed in a way that mirrored the unease blooming in Maya's gut. "That shouldn't be possible," he finally rasped. "Where the void did you even find? Lin, this is way above our clearance. Report it up the chain, and pray to whatever gods humans believe in that they take it seriously." That spark of doubt, the reflex to follow the rules just to cover yourself, was like ice water dousing the jolt of adrenaline. Maya had felt that same weary cynicism seep into her own bones over too many years listening and never taking part. Karn listened. She played a few more seconds, just enough for the panicked thrum to become audible even before translation. That's someone begging for help, and if the hegemony, the freaking hegemony, needs help. She trailed off, because what came next was the truly terrifying implication. Whatever this mess was, it was big enough to threaten the most ruthlessly dominant force the galaxy had seen in centuries. And Earth, with its outdated tech and barely a handful of off-world colonies, was supposed to do. What exactly? The response from official channels was infuriatingly predictable. Disbelief, followed by a flurry of panicked reports, passed between departments, leading to an ominous black hole of silence as someone with actual authority got dragged into the mess. Maya spent a restless night bouncing between obsessive decoding attempts on her home terminal and spiraling through worst-case scenarios. If this was a trap, it was a damn good one, unlike any sloppy propaganda she'd seen before. If it was real, then the galaxy was even more screwed than anyone realized. By morning, the comm buzzed to life with a summons so high on the chain, it probably violated some protocol she wasn't aware of. Not an in-person meeting, thankfully. The idea of being scrutinized in some sterile conference room made her skin crawl. But the grim-faced hologram of Counselor Nima was a close second in intimidation factor. "Lin, your discovery has caused," the counselor paused, mandibles clicking in an insectile approximation of a sigh, "considerable disruption. I must understand how such a sensitive signal made it past initial filters, and more importantly, why you decided to pursue this." That last bit was phrased as a question, but Maya knew a thinly veiled accusation when she heard one. It was the standard move. Find the underling to blame, contain the problem, get back to the business of appeasement the hegemony so delicately balanced itself upon. "Counselor," she replied, the tremor in her voice more from anger than nerves. "Basic translation is in my job description." It became clear this was a distress call, an urgent look if humans had sent out a signal like that, wouldn't you want someone to actually listen? Counselor Nima, to her credit, didn't spout the usual platitudes about Earth's status with a pitying undertone. She actually seemed to consider the question before her compound eyes swiveled to focus on some unseen data feed. Unfortunate comparison, the counselor finally said. We've never had the temerity to directly confront the hegemony. Now, the linguists have had trouble with the language. Are you confident this is a plea for aid, or could it be mistranslated? Maya hesitated, the doubt creeping back in. Reasonably confident, yes, but whoever sent it, they're familiar with the hegemony's standard protocols, the way they encode sensitive. The counselor cut her off with a flick of her antennae. Enough technical detail, Lynn. I have what I need for the moment. Remain available, but consider this matter classified until further notice. The hologram blipped out, leaving Maya feeling even emptier than before. That brief interaction was likely the closest she'd come to actually influencing the course of things, and it had achieved less than nothing. There was a single incoming message on her work terminal when she returned the next day. Marked classified origin point, a research hub she'd never heard of. Attached was a partial translation of the signal. It was enough. The fragmented pleas, the references to vast fleets silenced, entire worlds culled, and beneath it all, the terrifying words, "They control our minds." Someone in the hegemony was not only reaching out to their enemies, but also exposing their most terrifying secret. And Earth was expected to do absolutely nothing about this. Going against everything her cautious instincts screamed, Maya sent a reply. The research hub had set up a backchannel buried under layers of encryption that made her head spin. Each message felt like laying a single brick in the construction of her own treason case, should anyone find out. Her first question was simple: who are you? The response came hours later, the sheer tension of waiting making the bland comm center feel even more stifling. It began with an identifier code, untraceable as far as she could tell, followed by an explanation couched in a species-specific philosophical tradition Maya barely grasped. But its meaning was clear enough. Artist-scholar, forced into servitude like so many of my kind. She typed back, hands shaking slightly. Can you prove this? Hegemony tricks. Nothing for a long stretch of time. Then a flurry of images so chaotic yet specific they had to be genuine. Star charts the hegemony would never publicly release, internal schematics for what looked like horrifying mass-scale thought manipulation devices, even security footage of a Xylari, the renowned artistic race slumped in a dirty jumpsuit, their expressive tendrils twitching in an obvious distress pattern. You are taking a great risk. The Xylari, she still didn't have a name, only the ID code messaged. They will be searching for the source of the leak. Because even the hegemony can't be everywhere at once, Maya thought, a grim sort of determination pushing back against the fear. Are there others like you who want to fight? That's complicated. Most species surrendered long ago. The technology breaks the will. We know, Maya cut him off. That's part of the signal. But not everyone. Are you telling me you're alone in this? A hesitation, so long she wondered if the connection had been broken. Then, not alone, but scattered, fearful. Hope died hard in our galaxy, human. There was a bitter truth in that, echoing Maya's own cynicism from barely a week before. But now, mixed with a fury, there was a spark of something else. Humans were newcomers on the galactic stage, dismissed by most, which meant they had no grand reputation to lose. She started typing, then deleted it. Too many ways to misinterpret text. Instead, Maya activated the voice function, something rarely used in her line of work. Listen, she said, the tremor in her tone unavoidable. I know how it looks. Earth is. We're not a major player here. But I also know we're not the only ones disgusted by what the hegemony does. Maybe what you need isn't another army. It's a reminder that fighting back is even possible. A long silence stretched out. The Xylari, whoever he was, likely assumed this was naive bluster, the posturing of a species untouched by true oppression. Humans had faced conflict, sure, but nothing on this scale. Then the reply came, not in text, but in a short audio file. It was a song, for lack of a better term. A single female Xylari voice, haunting and discordant, weaving a melody filled with echoes of battle cries from a dozen subjugated worlds. Maya didn't understand the words, but the raw emotion needed no translation. "We may fight," the Xylari messaged after "Tell me, human, what weapons do you bring to this war?" Weapons? Maya had to suppress a humorless laugh. Earth's military was respectable for self-defense against the occasional pirate, maybe settling local disputes with their few colony worlds. Against the Hegemony, it might as well be launching slingshots at a battleship. But she'd gotten this far on a mix of stubbornness and a knack for finding solutions where they shouldn't be. "Not the kind you're thinking of," she finally typed back. "Humans are adaptable. We're good at making things work with what we have." That was an understatement. Humanity's arrival on the galactic scene had been met with a mix of curiosity and dismissal. Turns out, centuries of sci-fi scenarios hadn't prepared the galaxy for a species whose tech progressed in messy leaps, who cobbled together unlikely solutions just because they could. The Xylari's answer held skepticism. "Your adaptability is why you remain unaligned. It suggests a lack of central strategy." That one stung. "We're new at this," Maya shot back, temper getting the better of her. "Cut us some slack. And unaligned is better than being on our knees like most of you." The silence that followed wasn't the ominous kind. This felt like she'd given the Xylari pause. It was a strategic opening, small, but an opening nonetheless. When the reply finally came, it was less a question, more a reluctant challenge. The Hegemony thrives on control. Order imposed with ruthless efficiency. Can adaptability overcome that? It was a test, and Maya knew the fate of maybe more than just Earth hung on her answer. Everything she felt, the anger and frustration, even the fear, she channeled that, not into despair, but into the fierce certainty she rarely let surface. "Control is predictable," she began, fingers flying over the keyboard. "Adapting means being one step ahead of what they predict. Look, I don't know how your mind tech works exactly, but I bet it boils down to patterns, finding and exploiting them. Humans, we don't run in neat patterns. Our brains are messy, maybe even messy enough to slip through the net." A risky gamble, a theory based on a hunch and her own fragmented understanding of the half-translated Hegemony documents. Yet the Xylari seemed to be mulling it over, a flicker of a long-extinguished hope sparking in the stilted cadence of his messages. Before she could second-guess herself, Maya sent one last message. "If your people want to fight back, give us something to work with. Everything you know about how they control you, and I mean everything, we'll find a way to use it against them." There was no response for the rest of her shift. Maya left work not in her usual exhausted days, but with a thrumming nervous energy that made sleep impossible. She'd set something in motion, something reckless and possibly suicidal. Yet, as she stared at the too familiar city skyline, she felt oddly more alive than in months. The waiting was agonizing. Not the passive waiting of bureaucracy, but the kind filled with frantic behind-the-scenes work no one was supposed to know about. Maya roped in a small, trusted circle. Raj, an ex-military engineer with a rebellious streak disguised by his unassuming demeanor. Elena, a master linguist specializing in obscure dialects who was always up for an intellectual challenge. Even Karn, her supervisor, drawn in not by her impassioned pleas, but by the sheer audacity of the scheme starting to take shape. They met in forgotten corners of the comms hub, in the guise of discussing some tedious protocol update. Maya's apartment, crammed with hastily ordered tech she barely understood, looked like the inside of a conspiracy theorist's brain exploded. The Xylari, true to his word, started sending a steady stream of data. Schematics, code fragments, even intercepted command orders were dissected, rebuilt, and poked at from every angle. The Hegemony was frighteningly efficient, but no system was perfect. It took Maya a week of caffeine-fueled, obsessive work to spot the first pattern that was an actual weakness. The control tech, it seemed, wasn't a blanket suppression field. It operated on targeted neural frequencies, each species assigned a unique code tailored for maximum subjugation. "They're sloppier than I thought," Elena muttered, blinking wearily at the dataviz Maya projected. "See these outliers? It's not variance from the norm, it's like background noise in the signal." Raj, ever the pragmatist, squinted. You mean some people, their brains don't match the control frequency naturally. More like the signal bounces off some and gets scrambled in others, Maya clarified, a thrill of discovery trumping exhaustion for the moment. It's inconsistent, which from a galactic domination standpoint is a huge vulnerability they've managed to overlook. Suddenly, the messy complexity of the human brain wasn't a weakness, but a potential weapon. There was no way to test this theory without exposing people to the control signal itself, a horrifying ethical breach, yet the alternative was letting the galaxy rot under the hegemony. It was Karn, of all people, who broke the tense silence. The odds are not in our favor, he stated, antennae twitching in agitation. Even if this resistance of yours is real, we'd need thousands of off-spec individuals just to have an impact, and he trailed off, not needing to finish the thought. Earth didn't have the population density of established core worlds, and those under hegemony control were essentially prisoners. But Maya's mind was already racing, latching onto the glimmer of possibility. We don't need thousands, she replied, the words spilling out half-formed. Not if they're in the right places, causing the right kind of chaos. The hegemony's power comes from everyone believing they're untouchable. What if we shake that belief? The looks she got ranged from skepticism to a sort of terrified admiration. The plan, as it started to coalesce, was as insane as the situation demanded, a testament to the desperation echoing in the frantic coded messages they kept receiving from the Xylari. They might not have an army, but humans had something the galaxy seemed to have forgotten. Rebellious spirit. The old Earth phrase "a whisper can start an avalanche" took on a terrifyingly literal meaning. Maya's team turned their focus away from brute force and towards the meticulous planning of a galaxy-wide disinformation campaign. Their most potent weapon, Earth's fragmented, contradictory, often infuriatingly illogical culture. Pop songs spliced with coded revolutionary slogans targeted at specific subjugated species. Ancient Earth battle speeches overlaid onto intercepted hegemony comms frequencies. Memes, those bizarre units of Earth humor, seated where hegemony surveillance was weakest, designed to leak and spread organically. If you think you understand how humans communicate, you understand nothing, Elena remarked, a manic glint in her eyes as she crafted strings of seemingly nonsensical text. They'll dismiss this as gibberish at first. The key was triggering the control tech's overreaction. They needed the hegemony to see a threat where none existed, to scramble forces overreacting to what seemed like rebellions flaring in the most unexpected places. Doubt, confusion, the cracking of the illusion of absolute power, those could be just as deadly to a regime as any weapon. Raj was in charge of the trickiest part, repurposing civilian tech on an almost comical shoestring budget. Obsolete Earth satellites got jury-rigged to blast targeted signals. Long-range comms relays, meant for scientific expeditions, got finicky software patches until they could, theoretically, piggyback on the hegemony's own network. We're going to take down an interstellar dictatorship with the equivalent of duct tape and recycled scrap, he muttered, grinning despite the obvious stress. Karn, to Maya's surprise, became an unlikely master of bureaucratic obfuscation. Reports got lost, supplies misdirected, official channels of inquiry bogged down in a tangle of pointless regulations. It was a house of cards built on sheer audacity, every hour bringing them closer to the moment someone, human or hegemony, would notice and the whole thing would come crashing down. Yet Maya realized they were already more dangerous than the official might of Earth could ever be. Then it was time. Elena hit the trigger, sending their first wave of disruption. For days, a tense silence filled Maya's cobbled-together command center. Had they been detected immediately? Was their patchwork scheme failing before it truly began? The answer came not from hegemony surveillance, but from the Xylari instead. Panic. The word barely captured the sheer chaos woven into his coded messages, but beneath it was a desperate, ragged thread of hope. They are overreacting, protest where there were none, orders being questioned for the first time in centuries. You have started something. Something. That was all they'd hoped for, all they could manage. A nudge to the galaxy, proof that defiance wasn't entirely dead. Whether that spark would ignite a true rebellion or get brutally extinguished was still agonizingly unknown. But they'd moved from being spectators to players in the game, and that shift, Maya knew, could never be fully reversed. The hegemony, so long accustomed to absolute control, floundered spectacularly. Maya's team reveled in the chaos their carefully planted disruption sowed, yet fear gnawed at the edge of the grim euphoria. News feeds, even official hegemony channels, they'd managed to partially infiltrate, buzzed with a confused mixture of propaganda and genuine signs of distress. Minor supply worlds erupted in protests, bafflingly timed to coincide with the transmission of a centuries-old Earth sitcom about ragtag rebels outsmarting a technologically superior foe. A Xylari work crew, seemingly unremarkable, cut communications to an entire sector by accidentally sabotaging their own equipment during a carefully orchestrated rendition of an atonal human industrial music track. "They don't know where to hit back," Raj observed, his usual smirk tinged with exhaustion. "We've turned their strength centralized control against them. Every blip looks like the start of a revolution." It couldn't last. The hegemony would adapt, isolate the source of the chaos. It was a race against time, every flicker of manufactured defiance, buying the real resistance a few precious moments to organize. Elena, poring over Xylari data, made the discovery that turned hope into a razor-sharp strategy. "The control signal, it's not just about suppression," she explained, the quiet intensity in her voice making the team lean in closer. "It's a two-way system. They monitor reactions, calibrate for maximum obedience." Maya got where she was going before Elena even finished the sentence. "If we overload it, create a feedback loop. We might just fry their precious tech," Raj finished, a wicked grin spreading across his face. "We turn their weapon into a liability." The plan was as simple as it was brutally dangerous. Each outbreak of defiance would be paired with a targeted sonic pulse, cobbled together from research instruments, atmospheric monitors, basically anything capable of emitting frequencies at the carefully calculated range. The goal: overload the control tech to the breaking point, if they were lucky, even disable it across entire sectors. For the species long subjugated, the risk was almost unbearable. Even a momentary lapse in hegemony control could mean brutal reprisals. But the Xylari and their tenuous network of allies were desperate enough to clutch at the lifeline Earth offered, no matter how dangerous. The first surge was a gamble. They targeted a densely populated industrial world, slave laborers vital to the hegemony's war machine. Elena's sonic pulse, a discordant blast that made Maya wince even through the simulation, synced with a flood of protest songs and fiery speeches in the native tongue. The response was immediate. Hegemony communications crackled with alarm, troop deployments scrambled. But within minutes of the initial surge, a different tone crept into the intercepted orders. Confusion. Then a system-wide calm blackout. "Did we do it?" Raj breathed, staring at the readouts in disbelief. It wasn't victory, Maya knew. More likely, they'd forced an entire sector offline, the control tech malfunctioning under the strain. But it was proof their outlandish scheme could inflict real damage on an enemy they couldn't hope to match on any conventional battlefield. Victory, if it could even be called that, was a double-edged sword. Word of the sector going offline buzzed through their illicit information channels, a mix of terrified hope, renewed determination, and fear of the backlash to come. Hegemony retaliation was expected, brutal, likely indiscriminate. But to Maya's grim relief, it didn't come immediately. Ships were diverted, resources stretched thinner than before, but there was a sense of stunned disarray rather than a focused counterattack on Earth itself. It bought them time, if nothing else. They're turning inwards, Karn, ever the analyst, remarked, antennae twitching in a pattern Maya still couldn't fully decipher. Hunting for saboteurs, stamping out any hint of dissent. Their vaunted efficiency is backfiring spectacularly. They doubled down. The sonic pulses became bolder, each calibrated to cause maximum disruption on strategic targets. Maya and her team worked themselves to ragged exhaustion, the line blurring between brilliance and the kind of madness born from desperation. It was Raj who noticed the unexpected side effect first. "Wait, is that? No, it can't be," he muttered, rewinding an intercepted hegemony transmission. They clustered around his terminal. There, beneath the panicked commands and thinly veiled threats, was an undercurrent of something else. Not defiance, not quite, but a dissonant note within their tightly organized communication structure. Individual initiative, Elena frowned, then her eyes widened. They're used to following orders blindly. Now they're having to think for themselves. Some of them don't seem to like it much. It was a small crack, easily mended if the Hegemony leadership recognized the threat. But Maya, remembering the Xylari's initial skepticism about the messy thing that was the human mind, saw potential. She tapped a few keys, pulling up a data stream. They always touted the efficiency of their control tech, she mused. What happens when the tech glitches, and that efficiency turns into vulnerability? They were gambling with lives, hers and the countless others caught in this war, playing a game with consequences far beyond what any of them could fully comprehend. Yet she couldn't shake the sense they might be changing the rules in ways the Hegemony couldn't adapt to fast enough. Then came the counterstrike that proved her both right and terrifyingly wrong. It wasn't targeted at Earth, at least not directly. Instead, the Hegemony hit one of Maya's team. Karn, quietly brilliant and always one step ahead in anticipating bureaucratic roadblocks, was the one who got singled out. His calm buzzed not with the usual flurry of reports, but a single, stark summons to appear before a special tribunal hastily thrown together in the name of dealing with internal threats. It was only a matter of time, Karn said, a grim composure fighting the fear in his eyes. They know someone on Earth is enabling this. This rebellion, targeting a mid-level official, is meant to send a message. Maya could only watch, helplessness twisting into a rage hotter than ever before. Karn's existence was usually one of overlooked tedium, which was what made him so valuable. Now their meticulous attempts to erase their tracks had crumbled somewhere along the way. They'd become too successful for their own good. The tribunal was a formality, the verdict a foregone conclusion. Yet, even in the face of disgrace and a likely death sentence, Karn did something unexpected. He played along, seemingly cowed, citing bureaucratic missteps and his own failures, and slipped Maya a data chip. I salvaged what I could, he whispered as they hauled him away, his normally meticulous antennae drooping in a gesture of defeat that Maya desperately hoped was merely an act. The chip was their lifeline. He'd managed to copy a shocking amount, intercepted orders, panicked troop movements, and most crucially, scrambled blueprints of what was clearly an evolved version of the control tech. The Hegemony, at the height of their arrogance, had overlooked their vulnerability. They were so focused on stamping out rebellion that they'd left a glaring weakness exposed. They're getting smarter, Raj analyzed, concern furrowing his brow. Trying to compensate for our disruptions, make it less of a brute force tool and more nuanced. Which means they're vulnerable to countermeasures, Maya retorted, a desperate plan forming in her mind. She turned to Elena. Do we have enough data to reverse engineer it? Find its frequencies, the signal modulation patterns? Elena hesitated. It'll take time we don't have. There was pity in her gaze, an unspoken understanding that Maya was about to ask the impossible of her team. But sometimes the impossible was the only option left. Karn bought us that time, Maya said, her voice low and filled with grim determination. He did his part. Now it's our turn to do something that will honor that sacrifice. The command center felt too quiet with Karn absent. His meticulous notes and dry observations were replaced by a desperate hum of activity, broken by frantic curses and the occasional snatch of exhausted laughter that had a hysterical edge to it. Elena became the heart of that effort, her usual focus sharpened to a near-obsessive intensity. Maya and Raj pushed their tech expertise to the breaking point, cobbling together a Frankenstein-esque device that, with a bit of luck and generous interpretation of physics, just might be able to hijack the very system designed to enslave billions. Earth's top scientific minds would scoff at the sheer audacity of it. There were no safety parameters, no time for trial and error. It was the grandest, most reckless hack ever attempted, made from salvaged parts and fueled by desperation potent enough to crack planets in half. Even the Xylari seemed to hold his breath, his coded messages fewer, but laced with a tension that mirrored Maya's own. He, perhaps better than anyone, understood the gamble they were about to take. News of Karn's execution reached them just as Elena announced she might, just might, have a workable signal pattern. It was less a moment of grief than a cold fury that galvanized them further. They'd turned from unlikely disruptors to martyrs in the making. There was no going back now. "They want to scare us into submission," Raj muttered, then surprised them all with a vicious grin. "So let's give them something to be really scared of." The makeshift broadcast rig was jury-rigged atop Earth's highest comm tower. Old protocols designed to deal with solar flares and asteroid debris became the flimsy shield against hegemony detection for just a little longer. Maya held the activation key in her hand, literally and metaphorically. It felt like the weight of a dying world was on her finger. "If this works," she began, and couldn't even finish the thought. The consequences of success and failure were equally vast, equally terrifying. "It has to," Elena said, her usual cynicism tempered by a desperate hope. "It's the only way." They synced the activation with a coordinated series of rebellions on several hegemony-controlled planets. It was a long shot, a distraction tactic, but their inside knowledge of the enemy's overstretched resources meant even a small uprising could cause major chaos. Then Maya hit the switch. The surge of power threatened to overwhelm the jury-rigged tech. Their scrambler pulsed, the feedback nearly deafening, carrying Elena's signal through the hacked hegemony channels on a wave of pure, defiant static. It wouldn't scramble minds, not directly, but it would overpower the very system the hegemony relied upon for control. And in that moment of disarray of machines malfunctioning and commands shattering against their perfect obedience protocols, Maya hoped that somewhere some oppressed individual would seize their sliver of freedom and run with it. The effect wasn't immediate. No dramatic explosions lit up their sensor readouts, no triumphant messages of liberation flooded in from the Xylari or any other suppressed world. Instead, there was a jarring, disorienting silence where the constant hum of hegemony orders should have been. Then it hit. Maya watched as their network feeds flickered to life, a jumbled torrent of intercepted comms and smuggled updates. Chaos, but a beautiful, terrifyingly hopeful kind. "It's working," Raj shouted, relief washing over his exhausted features. System-wide lockups, ships misfiring, troops on the ground scrambling. Amidst the panicked blur of hegemony orders, there were other voices. The Xylari, their carefully orchestrated resistance gaining traction in the disarray. A dozen more species, long thought broken, rising in defiance fueled by the sudden, fragile chance their oppressors could falter. It wasn't outright victory. The hegemony was too vast, their power too deeply entrenched to simply collapse overnight. But the cracks Maya and her team had painstakingly created were widening at an exponential rate. Panic bred mistakes. Maya's screens lit up with reports of hasty retreats turning into routes, supply lines cut off not by rebel attacks, but by malfunctioning tech and confused chain of command. It wasn't the clean, decisive victory Earth-based war simulations often modeled, but a glorious mess of unpredictable, cascading failures. Then the first major win. An entire system, heavily industrialized and strategically vital, simply went offline. Overwhelmed control tech gave way to a workers' revolt brutally suppressed for centuries, now reigniting with a ferocity that caught the hegemony off guard. It was a pattern repeating across a dozen worlds, a dozen species. Each act of rebellion, no matter how small, further strained the system, pushed it closer to collapse. And the thing about collapse, as Maya had learned, is that it could be shockingly swift once it reached critical mass. In the quiet moments between frantic bursts of coding and intercepted comms analysis, a sense of unreality settled upon them. They'd flipped the script not just of their own lives, but of an entire galactic order, and now they had to figure out how to shepherd a revolution they never expected to lead. The Xylari reached out after days of tense silence. Their comm channels were more secure now, the hegemony's panicked focus on external threats, leaving some gaps in their surveillance of conquered worlds. There was no mistaking the awe in his usually clipped messages. "You have surpassed all expectations. The galaxy has not seen defiance on this scale in centuries." Followed by the inevitable and infinitely more complicated question, what now? It was a question Maya spent sleepless nights grappling with. Earth had the technology to sow chaos, the audacity to exploit the enemy's weaknesses. It hadn't been enough before, and it sure wasn't going to be enough now that the hegemony was roused and fighting back with the fury of a cornered beast. "We built a detonator," she confessed to Raj and Elena, the makeshift command center feeling too small in comparison to the scale of the conflict they'd sparked. Great at blowing things up, not so much at figuring out what to build in their place. Elena, surprisingly, was the one who brought the cold, strategic perspective they needed. The hegemony thrived on the illusion of perfect order. It's a liability now, but also an opening. Everyone's scrambling, which means some will rise to the top, not because the tech tells them to, but because they're actually good leaders. She had a point. The intercepted comms Maya poured through buzzed with an almost comical mix of blind panic and ruthless opportunism. There were hegemony commanders turning on each other for resources, local governors who used the chaos as a cover to consolidate their own power. Fractures, Raj noted, tracing the predicted troop movements on a star map. They were inevitable, always are in empires this big, but we've catalyzed the whole process. Maya's head spun. So we exploit those fractures, turn them against each other. Too cynical, Elena replied. Some are worth saving, some, well, let's just say the galaxy won't miss them. The point is, we offer a choice. Continue under the tyranny that's clearly crumbling, or side with this new rebellion built on. Well, on what exactly? That was the question no amount of tech savvy could answer. Maya looked out the smudged window of their HQ, not at the Earth skyline, but upwards. The stars felt closer now, the galaxy less a fixed playboard and more a swirling mass of possibilities. What now was a question for the Xylari and their allies, the enslaved species tasting their first intoxicating sip of freedom in centuries. But it was also, Maya realized, a question for Earth, forever changed by their desperate gamble. Humanity had a seat at the table now, not by might or tech, but by sheer audacity and a willingness to light the spark, consequences be damned. What to do with that power? That was both terrifying and the most exhilarating challenge Maya had ever faced. The war wasn't won with a single decisive battle, but in 1,000 grueling skirmishes, tense negotiations in hastily established comm channels, and heart-wrenching strategic losses that forced Maya and her team to recalibrate their tactics almost daily. The hegemony, true to their nature, thrashed against their own disarray. Yet, with each frantic overreaction, they alienated more potential allies, fueling the very defiance they sought to crush. Even the most ruthlessly pragmatic hegemony commanders were forced to weigh the cost of scorched earth tactics against the risk of rebellion spreading within their own ranks. It was, as Elena grimly observed, less like fighting a machine and more like battling a virus that exploited every vulnerability in the system. For Earth, the days of scrambling on the galactic fringes were over. Officially, they remained neutral, the tiny backwater planet that was barely a footnote in anyone's reports. Unofficially, their tech expertise, now battlefield-tested, became the most valuable commodity on the market. The Xylari, their surviving leaders hardened and tempered by a fight Maya couldn't fully comprehend, emerged as the reluctant heart of the rebellion. It was their world that became the nexus of frantic communication and strategizing, their scholars and artists who started formulating something Maya found herself thinking of as a philosophy of galactic freedom. They always knew resistance wasn't only about fighting, she told her team, struck by the sheer poetic justice of the most ruthlessly suppressed species becoming the voice of a new era. It was about remembering what was worth fighting for. Raj, forever the realist, countered, words aren't going to win a war alone. There's former hegemony tech getting reverse-engineered on a dozen worlds, armies forming. And they're looking to us, Maya finished, an uncomfortable thrill running down her spine. Earth was becoming the armory, in a sense. Humans, with their adaptability and stubborn love for the impractical, were damn good at repurposing the tools of oppression. The offers trickled in, then became a flood. Factions seeking alliance species Maya had barely heard of before asking for support, rival hegemony commanders looking to defect if they were guaranteed a seat at the new table. And somewhere in this mess was Karn, if the coded messages they occasionally intercepted were to be believed. Her old supervisor was alive, and by all accounts a surprisingly effective leader of his own small band of rebels, his bureaucratic expertise becoming an ironic asset in outmaneuvering the hegemony on their own playing field. Life became a constant triage of strategy sessions in borrowed calm relays, arguments with sleep-deprived alien dignitaries, and frantic attempts to prioritize requests. Weapons for this besieged planet, jamming tech for that one, intel on troop movements for this other. Maya started to understand the intoxicating, terrible lure of power on a galactic scale. Yet, through the sleepless nights and the weight of decisions she never imagined making, there was an undercurrent of excitement. Earth was shaping this chaotic upheaval, their voices finally heard not through diplomacy, but through action. They'd gambled everything, and it might still end in disaster. But even if it did, Maya knew they'd forever change the equation. The galaxy wouldn't dismiss them so easily ever again. The turning point, when it arrived, wasn't what anyone expected. It wasn't a major hegemony military defeat, no heroic last stand or daring gambit that sent shockwaves across star systems. It began as a rumor, a whisper on barely secured comm channels, a scientific breakthrough. One of the most ruthlessly subjugated species, long thought broken, were not just resisting. They were offering a way out from under the yoke of the mind control tech. Maya could barely believe it at first, dismissing it as just another desperate act of defiance. Yet the data the Xylari provided was undeniable, even if the scientific principles it hinted at made her head ache. "They say it's based on the neurodiversity we stumbled upon," Elena explained, translating the dense report with a mixture of awe and frustration. "They weaponized what the hegemony saw as flaws, found a way to actively scramble the control signal beyond anything our tech can do." Raj, ever the engineer, focused on the immediate application. "Can we replicate it? If every rebellion cell had access to?" "It's not that simple," Elena interjected. "This isn't tech in the traditional sense. It requires, well, a certain mindset. They're still theorizing how to train others to do it. It's as much art as science, from what I can understand." Suddenly, the messy, chaotic nature of resistance became their greatest strength. The hegemony's mind control had tried to enforce a brutal uniformity, stamping out any spark of individuality. Now those they deemed flawed, broken, were the key to their downfall. It was a turning point far more profound than any battlefield victory. The hope it offered was like a beacon in the darkest hours of the war, and Earth, the outsiders long dismissed, were vital in spreading it. Their comms expertise turned from disrupting the enemy to setting up clandestine training networks. Maya found herself not just decoding orders, but translating Xylari philosophy text on embracing the unpredictable nature of consciousness, sending them to species struggling with the newly regained burden of free will. Karn's messages became less about tactics and more about negotiating with local hegemony officials trapped by their past allegiance yet tired of endless war. His quiet work, done with his usual bureaucratic precision, proved as vital as any weapon. Elena, to Maya's surprise, found herself drawn more to the theoretical puzzle than the fight itself. She started a dialogue with the Xylari scientists who led the breakthrough, their conversations a strange mix of equations and half-formed philosophical arguments. "They're turning rebellion into an intellectual pursuit," she remarked with an exasperated sort of admiration. "And somehow it's working." Maya was still in the thick of coordinating the practical side of the war, the shipments of tech, the weighing of desperate pleas for help against cold strategic necessity. Yet she found herself drawn to the changes happening on a deeper level. The galaxy, long stagnant, was churning with new ideas. Not every species was eager to embrace the chaos. Some clung to the old ways, even without hegemony control, but the shift was undeniable. Earth, with its own messy history of conflict and unity, was in a unique position to act as a bridge between those craving order at any cost and those willing to risk everything for an unpredictable future. The day Maya realized that was when she felt, for the first time since this improbable journey began, a flicker of hope that it wouldn't end in a galaxy simply trading one tyrant for many. Victory, like everything else in this war, was a messy, protracted affair. The hegemony, its power now fragmented, lashed out with a brutality that shocked even those hardened by the conflict. Whole planets were razed in retaliation. Promising rebel leaders were assassinated. Yet with every atrocity, the hegemony's grip weakened. Former allies defected in greater numbers, their own ranks fracturing between the pragmatists and the ideologues who still believed absolute dominion was possible. Earth paid its price as well. Hegemony warships, in a desperate gamble, made a long-range strike against the very calm towers they'd once ignored. Raj died in the initial bombardment, his dry wit and quiet brilliance snuffed out in an instant. Maya grieved, then poured her fury into retrofitting salvaged defensive tech, each successful counterattack fueled by a rage that honored her friend's memory. Elena's transformation was less violent, but no less profound. Her focus on resistance as an intellectual exercise blossomed into a full-throated defense of the power of the unpredictable. She became an unlikely spokesperson, her precise, ruthlessly logical arguments laying out the dangers of the old ways of thinking, the seduction of enforced order that had allowed the hegemony to flourish for so long. "We're not just fighting for freedom," she told Maya, an unfamiliar fire in her eyes. "We're fighting for the right to be flawed, difficult, to evolve in ways no algorithm can predict." Maya, up to her elbows in intercepted hegemony comms and frantic coordination with a dozen rebel factions, began to see the grand outlines of what might come after the war. It was terrifying, inspiring, and so quintessentially human that she couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. The war dragged on. Worlds were won and lost in a dizzying ebb and flow, alliances forged and broken with alarming speed. But with every setback, with every sacrifice, Maya found resolve hardening alongside her grief. They had come too far to let the galaxy fall back into old patterns. It was Karn who reappeared unexpectedly, with a weary grin and a plan so audacious that it just might work. His network of allies within hegemony ranks had yielded something priceless: the location of the central hub for the mind control tech. Striking it would be a death blow to what remained of their coordinated power. It would also likely be a suicide mission. The choice should have been agonizing. It wasn't. There was a grim sort of peace now in Maya, an acceptance that some fights were worth dying for. This, she knew with utter certainty, was one of them. The plan was pure distilled desperation, worthy of the ragtag outfit that had dared to stand against the hegemony. It relied on layers of deception, a feint towards a strategically valuable yet heavily defended sector, every trick of misinformation Maya and what remained of her team could muster. Earth's resources were stretched to breaking point. They diverted repurposed mining ships, sent ancient probes on kamikaze trajectories, anything to convince the paranoid remnants of hegemony command that this was the final decisive battle they were lured into. Meanwhile, the real strike team was a hodgepodge of rebels from a dozen different species, led by Karn and backed up by Elena's hastily adapted jamming tech. The target, a seemingly unremarkable planetoid in a backwater region of space. "If this works," Maya muttered, watching the stolen hegemony ship carrying their hopes disappear into hyperspace. "The tech dies and the entire command structure implodes. The war doesn't end instantly, but—" "The heart gets ripped out," Elena finished, a haunted look in her eyes. "That's the best anyone can hope for in wars like this." The waiting was almost worse than the frantic action of the early days. Maya obsessed over intercepted comms, searching for any sign of the strike team's success or their inevitable, brutal end. Each hour felt like a century, punctuated by bursts of activity. Coordinating supply drops on a besieged rebel world, countering hegemony propaganda with their own blend of truth and defiant hope. And then, the calm signal she'd both dreaded and prayed for flared into existence. Not from Karn, but from a Xylari commander known for his ruthlessly poetic battle reports. Success Control Hub destroyed Central Command in disarray rebellions across a dozen sectors. The victory report came intermingled with pleas for aid, descriptions of brutal hegemony reprisals, evidence of power vacuums already being filled by petty warlords looking to carve their own bloody empires amidst the chaos. It was ugly, hopeful, and proof that their gamble had paid off. The hegemony's grip was broken, but their long shadow still threatened to plunge the galaxy into an entirely new era of conflict. Sleep, an elusive luxury for the past few years, finally claimed Maya. She dreamt not of battles or strategy sessions, but of a conference table where hegemony officials sat stiff-backed next to Xylati diplomats, the arguments mediated by an Earth ambassador looking uncomfortably formal in their hastily tailored suit. She woke with a jolt, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. Maybe it was a naive fantasy, a childish yearning for the neat solutions that rarely existed. Yet there was a part of her, a defiant, stubborn part that had gotten them this far, refusing to let that dream go entirely. Peace, as it turned out, was a far dirtier, more exhausting business than war. The galaxy Maya found herself in wasn't the romanticized ideal she might have dreamed of in those first defiant stirrings of rebellion. It was fractured, grieving, and teeming with opportunists looking to fill the power vacuum left by the toppled hegemony. Worlds that had fought together against a common enemy descended into petty squabbles over resources and territory. Warlords rose, promising easy solutions and a return to the dubious comfort of order at any cost. Earth, elevated to a position of unexpected influence, became less a beacon of rebellion and more a target for resentment and suspicion. "We traded one galactic bully for a dozen smaller ones," Maya ranted to a surprisingly attentive group of Xylari diplomats during one tense negotiation session. Did anyone actually think about what after was going to look like? The senior diplomat, his expressive tendrils drooping in a gesture that might have been weariness or amusement, replied, "You humans are remarkable. You start wars you don't fully expect to win, then are surprised by the lack of tidy endings." Maya had to concede the point. Yet, beneath the biting humor, there was a flicker of understanding. The galaxy might be teetering on the edge of a new era of endless conflict, but there was also a sliver of opportunity, a space carved open by the sheer act of defying the inevitable. Elena, ever a strange mix of cynicism and idealism, focused on the human angle. "We're a mirror for them," she mused. "Our messy history, full of wars and alliances and all the gray areas in between, it's a roadmap, whether they like it or not. A reminder that unity isn't always clean or pretty." Karn, his scholar's demeanor tempered with the cold pragmatism of a resistance leader, put it bluntly, "The galaxy has forgotten how to negotiate, forgotten that conflict doesn't end with one side utterly vanquished. They want us to provide the answers, to force order upon this chaos." He paused. "They're looking for a new tyrant, just one with a prettier face." It was the pivotal moment. Maya realized why they had succeeded against the odds, why Earth had a fighting chance to shape this new era. They were not conquerors or ideologues. They were survivors used to scrambling their way out of tight corners, to finding unlikely alliances and even unlikelier solutions. The hegemony had thrived on division, on pitting species and worlds against each other. The only way to counter the chaos their downfall had unleashed was with something equally unpredictable, equally resilient. Hope, Maya realized with a jolt, was not a passive thing. It was action, stubborn and messy and prone to glorious failure. But the alternative was a galaxy slowly suffocating under the weight of its own cynicism. And that was a fate Maya refused to accept, even if it meant spending the rest of her life in endless, frustrating, and sometimes heartbreaking negotiation sessions. In the annals of galactic history, should anyone ever bother to write them, the period following the hegemony's fall would likely be known as the Era of Squabbles, or possibly the Great Galactic Headache. Maya, firmly entrenched at a negotiation table that had the permanence of a sandcastle during high tide, preferred a less glamorous, if more accurate term, the forever mess. It wasn't the grand intergalactic alliance she might have naively envisioned back when this all began. It was more like an extremely dysfunctional family reunion held at gunpoint, with Earth playing the role of the exasperated relative who somehow got stuck with all the cleanup. There were the idealists, veterans of the rebellion who clung to the dream of a perfectly unified galaxy and seemed personally offended by the sheer cussness of realpolitik. There were the pragmatists, ex-hegemony officials or warlords who'd shed their oppressors surprisingly quickly, now using the language of conciliation to mask their ruthless ambition. And there were those, representing both ravaged worlds, and those who'd largely escaped the conflict, who saw in Earth not a leader, but a resource to be exploited. Maya learned to navigate that mess, not with any grand charisma of her own, but with Earth's unique blend of stubbornness, begrudging helpfulness, and a healthy dose of exasperated sarcasm that turned out to be remarkably effective at cutting through the flowery speeches of intergalactic diplomacy. Elena found her voice as a counterpoint, laying bare the hypocrisy of those yearning for a return to the good old days of order and enforced unity. Her scathing essays, broadcast on channels no one thought to censor at first, became the reluctant conscience of the galaxy, reminding everyone what they had fought for and fought against. Karn, to Maya's surprise, reveled in the chaos. His talent for navigating bureaucracy, once a source of quiet frustration, became a vital skill in establishing channels of communication where none had existed for centuries. He brokered trade deals between former enemies, coaxed reluctant warlords into at least a semblance of disarmament, and somehow managed to create a relief network so convoluted yet grudgingly effective that both those providing and those receiving the aid loudly complained about it, while secretly acknowledging its necessity. Earth itself was forever changed. Their tech evolved with dizzying speed, shaped by the crucible of war and subsequent frantic attempts to undo the devastation. Homegrown scientists worked alongside refugees from conquered worlds, the sharing of knowledge born out of necessity rather than carefully negotiated treaties. The day Maya walked through the newly built shipyard, housing a hybrid of Hegemony and salvaged Earth tech, a vessel built not for war but deep space exploration, she felt an echo of the same awe and terror that propelled her into this whole mess. They were stepping into the unknown again. Earth had proven it had a voice, that it was more than a galactic backwater. But whether that voice would be used to build something lasting, or simply drown in the squabbles of the wider galaxy, that was an ending yet to be written. Time, once measured in heartbeats between stolen comm dispatches and desperate supply runs, became less a frantic sprint and more a slow, uneven marathon. Earth's rise was grudging, born out of equal parts respect and resentment. Their lack of a grand vision for the shape of galactic order, the very thing that frustrated so many, became a strength. It forced others to step up, to take responsibility for their own fates, instead of waiting for easy solutions from the upstarts who dared topple the status quo. Maya found herself in countless roles she could never have imagined. Mediator between former rebel commanders turned rival rulers on a devastated planet. Trade negotiator, fending off rapacious corporations and overzealous do-gooders in equal measure. Even reluctant spokesperson, giving speeches filled with uncomfortable truths and thinly veiled calls to actions that ruffled feathers from opulent star systems to the hardscrabble survivors of the hegemony's former industrial worlds. There was no shortage of problems to solve. War criminals slipped through the cracks of hastily constructed justice systems, their crimes eclipsed by the immediate need for stability. New alliances were forged and broken within a blink of a galactic news cycle. Entire species, ignored in the grand machinations of empires and rebellions, struggled with the messy complexities of suddenly having their voices heard. Yet, amidst the setbacks, and the moments where Maya just wanted to lock herself in her old calm center and forget about the wider galaxy, there were glimpses of something truly remarkable. The first multi-species research expedition, fueled by a mix of salvaged Hegemony tech and salvaged Earth audacity, reached a star system too remote to be considered strategically valuable in the relentless calculus of war. A pan-galactic arts festival, sparked by the Xylari and hosted on an otherwise unremarkable moon, became a hotbed of fiery debates and collaborative projects that bridged centuries of stifled expression. Earth found itself not at the center of a new empire, but as a nexus point in a suddenly vaster web of connections. It wasn't perfect. It would never be. But as she sat hunched over reports detailing trade routes, refugee resettlement plans, and the tentative reopening of long-dormant diplomatic channels, Maya felt less like a pawn swept up in events beyond her control, and more like a player who was begrudgingly getting the hang of the game. Karn found her there, a datapad in his hand, the ever-present weariness etched deeper around his eyes. Yet there was a new energy in his antenna twitch, an eagerness replacing some of the caution that had marked his early return to Earth. "We've got a problem," he announced, a familiar glint of amusement battling with the serious tone. Maya gestured to the database hovering in front of her. "Join the club. Which particular species is poised to declare war on its neighbor over mining rights this time? More interesting, Karn replied. Then his lips twitched in what she was learning to recognize as his version of a grin. We've been invited to join. Join what? Maya asked slowly, the exhaustion momentarily forgotten. The start of a new galactic alliance. Not perfect, messy as all void, but an alliance built not on fear this time. Think you can handle the negotiations? Hope, Maya realized, was a stubborn weed pushing through scorched ground. It wasn't naive optimism, but a defiant choice, made again and again in the face of countless reasons to succumb to cynicism. The galaxy might forever be messy, but in that messiness lay the potential for something better than the enforced monotony of the past. I think, she said, mirroring her old supervisor's grin, I'm starting to get the hang of this.